Now, today's daf is Kuf Dalid. We'll start with the Mishnah on Kuf Gimel Amid Beis. Kol HaKodshim she'era bahen psul kodem lef shaitan. So there's halacha that the Kohanim have a schus, a monetary right to receive the hides of the basar hakodshim, and one of the issues is whether those hides are considered part of the basar or maybe they stand alone as a separate entity. But now we're talking about a case where the karba was pasul. And the question is, do the Kohanim have any right to collect the hides even in event that the carbon is pasul? And the Mishnah says it depends. There's something called hafshata, which means that they skin the hide off the carcass of the animal. And if the psul was chal before they did hafshata, then the psul is chal on the entire animal, including the basar and the or and the skin and the hide, and therefore the kohen has no right to it. But li'achar shaitan, if let's say first they did the hafshata, and then let's say the kohen had the wrong machshava or whatever it is that passed the carbon, then since the hafshata was implemented before the psul was chal, therefore the or is a separate entity unto itself. And therefore, even though the psul be chal subsequently, it'll only be chal on the basar, not on the or. Now, this might have to do with another issue that'll come up later on, and that is, in order to be matir the basar, you need zrikas hadam. But the zrika cannot be matir the basar if the carbon is pasul. But nevertheless, the zrika magically could be matir the or for the kohanim, even though the carbon itself is pasul. So I'm not sure if he is allowed to do the zrika, but if he went ahead and he did the zrika, then the zrika would be matir. Again, this machlokas tanoim about this, but according to one sheet in the tanoim, would be matir the or. Omer Abchanina ba'askan kohanim miyomai lo ra'isi or sheyotze lebeis hasreifa. I never saw such a thing in my life, that they took the or, and because the carbon was pasul, they burnt the or, and they did not give it over to the kohanim. Omer Rabbi Akiva b'dvarav lamadnu shehamafshir es habachar v'nimtza treifa sheyeosu hakohanim v'oro. Now, the Gemara is going to go into great detail here about the comment of Rabbi Akiva and its relationship to the statement of Rabbi Chanina Skan Kohanim. But let's just make 2 points here. Point number one is that the Bechar here that Rabbi Akiva is referring to is really a category, is a specific carbon, but it's really indicative of an entire category of carbonos. So we shouldn't get too hung up on the laws of Bechar, although there will be a sugi about Bechar. But the real point here of Rabbi Akiva is that even though you found the animal to be a treifa, which means the carbon is pasul, and keep in mind, the carbon was not pasul because of some machshava of the Kohen at the Shas Avoda. The carbon was pasul from the get-go because, as it turns out, it was a treifa. And nevertheless, the R of that treifa is mutter to Kohanim. It's part of the zchus of the Kohanim. And why is that? Because they only discovered the treifus subsequent to the hafshata. And you and I would have said logically, well, Igloi milsul mafred, now we know retroactively that this carbon was pasul from the get-go. So it's not like the case where the Mishnah says in the Sefer that if the hafshata took place before the psul and the carbon, therefore the kohanim azocha in the in the what's what in the R. That's not so because this psul predated the hafshata, so that the R was never a separate entity. It was part of an entity of a carbon puzzle, and therefore it should really fit into the ratio. And that's why the Mishnah quotes the Chachamim who say at the end of the Mishnah, Lo ra'inu eino raya el yetzel beis hasreifa. No, no, no. The R has to be burnt because now we see that the animal was a treifa and the psul was chal even before he did the avshota. And apparently Rabbi Akiva understands, Rabbi Chanina ben Skanakonim, that the psul of tarfus is radically different than any other psul, and it only emerges as a halachic entity and a psul of the carbon only after you discover that the animal is a treifa. The discovery itself generates the tarfus. The tarfus is not a reality that existed, way back when, but rather it's a halachic status that is generated by the idea, by the moment that you find out and you become aware of the fact that it's a treifa. The Gemara says the following: Kol shelo zacha hamizbeach bibsara lo zachu hakohanim bi'ora. This is a quote from the previous Mishnah, and the Gemara is going to posit a contradiction between the previous Mishnah and this Mishnah. It says in the previous Mishnah, Afal gavda afsheteli or kodem zrika. It would seem from the previous Mishnah that if the Mizbeach is not Zocher, which might mean that, there was a psul that was chal in the carbon at any point whatsoever, even as late as Zrika, and the Mishnah says, Lo Zochu HaKohanim Biora, which sounds like flat, absolute exclusion of the rights of the Kohanim to the Or, whenever they discover the psul. And even if the psul was in the zrika, let's say after the afshotas or, nevertheless the kohanim don't get the or, and the or is burnt. We'll see where it's burnt, but that's something else. Mani. So let's assume now that the original Tana of the previous Mishnah is not the same Tana as the Tana of our Mishnah, but rather it's Rabbi Elazar b'Rabbi Shimon he. Ti Omar ein dam maratza ala or b'fnei atzmo. In other words, this whole concept that after you did the hafshata, the or stands on its own, and therefore even if there's a psul that's chal vis-a-vis the basar, nevertheless the zrika could be matir the or. Rabbi Elazar b'Rabbi Shimon rejects the whole thing because im ein basar ein dam. There's no such thing as dam being maratza the or. The or is secondary. It's not significant. The real significant thing is the basar, the emurim, and the basar that's eaten by the kohen, and the emurim that's burnt on the mizbeach. That's the purpose of the dam. The dam has no relationship to the or. But Amos Seifa, but now we look at our Mishnah, Kol HaKodshim she'eru b'hem psul kodem hafsheiton ein erosem l'kohanim, but li'achar hafshiton erosem l'kohanim. So that our Mishnah cannot be reflecting this sheet of Rabbi Elazar of Shimon. It must be a different Tana, because our Mishnah maintains that the or, once it was skinned off the back, off the carcass of the animal, it becomes a separate entity such that now the dam could be, right, through Zrika, could be matir the or for the Kohen. Is Ason Rebbe. That's going to be Rebbe Shita. The Omar, Rebbe Shita is Hadam Meratz al or b'fnei atzmo. That dam itself could have a direct ritzui power on the or, completely circumventing the basar. The basar is pasul. The dam cannot have any positive effect on the basar, but nevertheless it will have a direct impact on the or, to be mat to the or for the kohen. Is Reisha Rabbi Elazar of Shimon v'Seifa Rebbe? Shall we say that the previous Mishnah is to be attributed to Rabbi Elazar of Shimon, and then our Mishnah is to be attributed to Rebbe? Now we're going to have machlokas Abai v'Rav. Abai is going to try to work out the entire Mishnah based on the Sefer. In other words, he's going to reinterpret the Reisha so that it fits in with the Sefer. And Rav is going to do the exact reverse. Amar Abai, mida Sefer Rebbe. Let's start with the Sefer. We've already proven that according to the Sefer, that's our Mishnah here, Rebbe is correct that the dam and its zrika could be matir the R once the R was separated from the hides. Is in Reisha Nami Rebbe. We're going to have to somehow push in the Reisha so it fits in with Rebbe, so that the Mishnah will be consistent. Now, how do we do this? Mode Rebbe she'ein hefshet kodem zrika. They never did the hafshata before zrika. There was no point in doing so. So in reality, there was no such thing as hafshata before zrika. That's why the previous Mishnah mentions that the zrika cannot impact on the R because the hafshata was not implemented until after the zrika. They never did the hafshata before the zrika. So there was never a reality of hafshata which the dam could be matir the R. Luyitsuya, that's what Abai is pointing out. If you found the reality in which they went ahead and they did the hafshata before the zrika, then Enochinami, the zrika would be mat to the R. But that reality doesn't exist.
What the hafshata, the translation of the hafshata, it's
To
like
skin,
the
I think
flaying,
to rip off the hide.
Right, okay. Flaying or something, yeah.
Yeah. He says in common practice, I'm just reading the footnote here, they did not remove the hide before the zrika. Why?
So how'd they get the blood?
Yeah, because this would delay the zrika. The ikar mitzvah of the carbon is the zrika. We don't want to start, taking the carcass of the carbon after shechita before zrika and start skinning it. Rava Amar, Rava is going to go the opposite direction. Mida Reisha Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon, Seifa Nami Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon. The better way of going, says Rava, is to interpret our Mishnah in such a way that it fits in with the Shita of Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon, which means that even in a case where they did the hafshata before the Zrika could have no impact on the hides, on the R, if the basar is possible, because once the carbon is possible, zrika could only impact on the basar and then memela on the R, but there's no direct relationship between the zrika and the R. So now we have a problem. What do we do with the seifa? My kodem hefshet. What does our Mishnah mean when it says that it's before the hefshet? Umay achar hefshet kodem sheniru lehefshet achar sheniru lehefshet. So now the Gemara, according to Rava, is stooping in a few extra words here in the Mishnah. And although the Mishnah says that the karba became possible before the hafshata, let's not take that literally, says Rava. But rather, we're talking about zrika. And the key of keys here is whether or not the hafshata took place before the zrika or after the zrika. If it took place before the zrika, then the kohanim will not have a schus in the R, because we're going like Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon that the zrika could, to the same extent, it cannot be matir, the basar cannot be matir, the R. But if, on the other hand, the psul in the carbon, meaning the meat itself, the basar, whether it be the basar of the murim faktor, whether the basar for the achilas kohanim, it only became possible after the zrika. So then we're going to hold, according to Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon, that once the zrika was done before the psul was chal, then although the meat you cannot eat, but the R goes to the kohanim. So it's really fascinating. The machlokas now between Rabbi Elazar, Reb Shimon, and Rebbe goes in two different directions. You can't say clearly who's the machmir and who's the mekil, because on the one hand, Rebbe has a kula vis-a-vis the R that the zrika, even after the psul in the basar, could be matir the R. On the other hand, Rabbi Elazar, Reb Shimon has a kula in which he says that if the hafshata took place after the zrika, then the or goes to the kohanim, despite the fact that the korban became possible and the meat has to go to the Beis Hasreifa. So the Gemara says, and where is this machlokas between Rebbe and Rebbe Elazar Reb Shimon? Where do we find it? In the Sanya, we find it in a brisa. Rebbe Omer. Rebbe says, and now we're on Daf Kuf Dal. Rebbe says, Hadam Maratza Allah or Bifnei Atzmo. Rebbe's shita is that you can have a direct relationship between the Zrikas Hadam to be matir the or as a separate entity. Even though the Zrika has no impact on the basar, it will have an impact on the or. Chu ima basar. If the skin has not been removed from the basar, then everything depends on the basar. But nolad bo psul ben konim zrika ben liachar zrika harehu kayotze bo. So in other words, according to Rebbe, the status of the or will be equal to the status of the basar, and therefore everything depends upon the psul in the basar. So you cannot have, according to Rebbe, a situation where the basar is pasul, but since there was a question of whether or not the kohanim have a right to the or, that we would separate those questions. But Rebbe Elazar Reb Shimon says no. Ein adom ratzah b'fnei atzmo. Although, according to Rebbe Elazar Reb Shimon, the dam could not be matir the or if the or was skinned and was removed from the animal, because everything depends, according to Rebbe Elazar Reb Shimon, on the basar. Shuima basar nolad bo psul kodem zrika reu kayotze bo. So just like the zrika now, after the psul was chal, cannot be matir the basar, according to Rebbe Elazar Reb Shimon, it cannot have any power on the or, even though the or had afshata before the psul was chal. But achar zrika, if let's say the korban was kosher and the psul, let's say of nolad, of yotze or tame took place after the zrika, in all those cases, hurtza basa sha'achas yafshitenu ve'or lakohanim. Since there was one moment in time between the zrika and the tuma or the yotze, when the basa was kosher and the zrika impacted with a chalos matir on the basar, then even though the korban became possible subsequently, nevertheless, since he did afshata and the zrika was chal on the or together with the basar, because the psul was only chal later on, therefore, according to Rebbe Elazar Reb Shimon, the or goes to the kohen. The Gemara wants to know, Lema bid Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Yeshua kamifki. Maybe this machlokes between Rabbi Elazar, Reb Shimon, and Rebbe is an old machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer, I should pronounce it correctly here, and Rabbi Yeshua. The Sanya we learned in the Brisa, V'asisa ola secha habasar v'hadam. So now the Torah puts together basar and dam in one breath, and that's very odd that the dam is mentioned after the basar. L'chora, the basar depends upon dam. It's not that the dam depends upon the basar. So this is who we're starting with. We're starting with Rabbi Yeshua. So Rabbi Yeshua darshans, im ein dam ein basar, im ein basar ein dam. According to Rabbi Yeshua, since the Torah equated dam and basar, it's telling you that dam and basar go together. You can't separate the dam from the basar. You can't have a situation where the dam, the way the Gemara understands it now, is going to be matir the or without the basar. It's dam and basar as one whole entity. But Rabbi Eliezer Omer, he disagrees. Dam afal pisha ein basar. I'm going to quote another source in the Torah, and I'm going to derive from that source that you can have an impact and a validation of the dam through its zrika even if there's no basar. Let's say the basar gets lost or it becomes tame. Nevertheless, Rabbi Eliezer insists that the dam could, in Yiddish we say uftu, it could accomplish. Shenemar v'dam zvochecho yishofech. In Cain, now we have a problem according to Rabbi Eliezer. What do we do with the pasuk Matov Yasiso L'secha Basar Adam? That seems to assume that there's no dam without basar. Lo malacha. This is a whole different story. Now, the kevesh, as you know, was the ramp that led up to the top of the mizbeach, and the Gemara earlier in Maseches Zevachim establishes that there's an airspace between the top of the kevesh and the mizbeach, which means that when the basar had to be, as it was transported up the kevesh by the Kohen, now had to be put onto the eish of the mizbeach for the aktoras haimurim, the Kohen would not be able to place it onto the eish directly because there was this airspace in between. He would have to throw it. And that's what we derive from this pasuk, according to Rabbi Eliezer, when it says, "V'asisa lasecha habasar v'hadam." It means that there's basar and there's dam. Ma dam, what's the tzushtel here to dam? Bizrika, right? The Torah says explicitly that the Kohen in the fourth avodah, the four avodas, has to do a zrika on the dam to get it up onto the mizbeach. And now we're saying halamadita that af basa b'srika, that even basa has to be thrown, obviously not on the mizbeach, but onto the eish al gavi mizbeach. Halamadita sherevach yesh ben kevesh lemizbeach.
I'm gonna have to, Rivers,
Yeah,
I'm sorry. I'm gonna have to go.
great.
I'm sorry. Okay, Shkoya.
Lema mandi omer hurtza Rabbi Eliezer, umandi omer lo hurtza Rabbi Yeshua. So the Rebbe said that you can have through the zrika a separate independent matir on the R on its own, even though the basar is possible. But Rabbi Eliezer holds that the and now we could link up Rebbe with Rabbi Eliezer and say that just like Rabbi Eliezer holds that the dam could be applied even where there's no meat, there's no basar. But Mandiam lo hurtza, but Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon, who said that even though you've already taken off the hide through hafshata, but the dam could not be valid for the R, and that reflects the opinion of Rabbi Yeshua, who says that there's no dam without basar. Gemara says, you know what? I'll leave it to Rabbi Lazar Kuliyamalo Pligi within the framework of Rabbi Eliezer's Shita. That Rabbi Eliezer holds that you can apply the dam even where there's no basar. Is Kuliyamalo Pligi? Everybody has to agree that the zrik would be mat to the or to the kohen, even though the meat is possible, even though the basar is possible. Ki pligi, where is there a machlokas tanoim between Belazar, Shimon, and Rebbe? That's only I'll leave it to Rabbi Yeshua, who says Rabbi Yeshua says there's no zrika sadam without basar, ein dam, man diamalo hurtzaki Rabbi Yeshua. We understand very well the opinion that there's no separate ritzui on the R on its own, right? After the basar was possible, and that's exactly what Rabbi Yeshua says. But Mandiam Hurtza, Rebbe, who is of the opinion that once you did the afshata, you can have a ritzui on the R, even though the basar is possible. Amuchag say Ad kan lokom Rabbi Yeshua hasam ela b'basar. When does Rabbi Yeshua say what he says? That the carbon itself, in order to be a valid carbon, you need the zrika sadam. that's only as far as fulfilling the obligation of being Ola Lishmo of the Bailim, the Lekab Seder Kohanim. There's no loss to the Kohanim because if there's no Zrikas Hadam, the Kohanim have no claim to the Or. Aval Or. But if you have a case where the carbon had a subsequent Zrika, and even though the carbon became possible, but nevertheless, Ikab Seder Kohanim, now the Kohanim are going to forfeit their rights to the or is afilu Rabbi Yeshua Modeh. In this case, Rabbi Yeshua would agree that you can have an effective Zrika Saddam just to be mata the or to the Kohanim, either the Havi Adievet. And now we're going to quote a brisa to show us that there's an impact of Zrika Bidievet. Disanyu nitma basar o nifsal yotza chutzakon, three different kinds of psulim, whether it's tamei, whether it became possible because of the machshavas kohanim, or when it was a psul yotzi was taken out of the azara. Is Rabbi Eliezer Omer Yizrok. Rabbi Eliezer goes as far as to say that you're allowed lechatchila to be zorik the dam, even though it's not going to be matir the basa. Rabbi Shomer Lo Yizrok lechatchila. Rabbi Yeshua says you don't throw the dam if it's not going to be matir the basa. But both Rabbi Yeshua zorak, but the Evid, Rabbi Yeshua agrees hurtza. So we see that Rabbi Yeshua is of the opinion that even though the basar is possible, since it still exists, it's not lost from the world. It became tamei or nifsal or yotze and so forth and so on, but it's still intact. Then the zrika sadam, although lechatchili shouldn't have done so, b'di'evet, post facto, it does effect a ritzui. And that's what Rebbe maintains, that according to Rabbi Yeshua, that Rebbe would say that even Rabbi Yeshua would agree that in the case where the basa no longer exists, and he was not allowed to throw the dam, but nevertheless, if he went ahead and he threw the dam, that's going to be matter at least the or. Rabbi Chanina ben Skana Kohanim. The Gemara tries to understand what Rabbi Chanina means, that he never saw that they took the or of the carbon and it became possible and they burnt it. Velo, how could that be? Parma nisraf v'sira nisrafim. These are karbanos that have to be burnt outside of the Beis Hamikdash, somewhere in the place that's designated for burning, and they're burnt even with their hides. So how could Rabbi Chanina say that he never saw burning of the hides? The answer is l'mitzvasim lo kamrina. You know, when you're talking about a mitzvah like Parma Nisrafim Siyun Nisrafim, where you have to burn the carbon, and that was done right somewhere in Yerushalayim, but you're going to burn the or as well. So Gemara asks, what about a case where there was a psul in the basa before the hafshata and even before the zrika, in which case the or became pasul, and just like the basa has to be burnt, so too the or has to be burnt. And the Gemara answers, chalutz ka'amrinan. I'm talking about a case where he separated the or, not when it was attached to the meat. Va'ika achar hefshed v'kodem zrika. How about a case where there was, this only according to Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon, there was already afshata, and that was done before the zrika. And Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon the Omer ein dam ratz ala or b'fnei atzmo, right? Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon disagreed with Rabbi Holt that there was no direct ritzui of the dam for the basar. I'm sorry, for the or, even though he did the afshata before the zrika. Nevertheless, the zrika can't be poil epis on the or because the zrika has to be poil on the basar, and there is no basar that's kosher. So why would Rabbanina say, according to that I never saw the or being burnt? The answer is Rabbi Chanina Rabbi Yisrael. He holds like Rebbe. And therefore, if Rabbi Chanina accepts the sheet of Rebbe, then if they did the afshata before the zrika, and then it became possible, and the zrika is not mat to the basar, but nevertheless it'll be mat to the or. Iboy, same another answer. Afilu took Rabbi Lazar, Reb Shimon, even though like Rabbi Lazar Shimon, where there cannot be a ritzui on the R without a ritzui on the basar, Modarebi, she'ein hefshe kodim zrika. Even Rebbe agrees that the hafshata generally never takes place before Zrika. As we said before, there's no reality of that. They wouldn't delay the Zrika for the sake of the hafshata. So therefore, Reb Chanina never saw a case of or hanifshat that was taken to the base hasreifa. What happens if after they did the Zrika, they discovered that in the innards, which was hidden from view, in the kishkis of the animal, there was a treifa. And if there was a treifa, now they already did the zrika sadam. The zrika can't be mata the treifa, not the basar, not the or. So they'd have to take out the basar and the or for sreifa. The more answers kasav, and if they treifa, they miyayim eratz. Rabbi Chanina is of the opinion that even if after the Zrika, they find out and they discover to their dismay that the animal was a treifa. That treifa is not chala mafreya. It's only chal mikano lahava from the moment that they discover it, and therefore the Zrika is matir. Again, it's not going to be matir the boss, the boss is treifa, but at least it can be matir the or. Tekanami, we like this explanation. Tekatani, it says in the Mishnah Rabbi Kiva. Midvarav lamadu shamafshir sabachar v'nimsa treifa ye'asa akonim bi'oro. Shmami, no, we see. I mean, basically, Rabbi Akiva is just reiterating what Rabbi Chanina said, namely that if you find out that the animal's a treifa, then that doesn't disqualify the power of the zrika lemafreya to be mat to the or. In fact, the Gemara, my Kamashmal and Rabbi Kiva. So what was Rabbi Kiva adding over here that I wouldn't know on my own? HaKamashmal and I feel a big fool that with regard to the R of a Bechar, then even though we found it to be a treifa, and we found this outside the Beis Hamikdash because a Bechar Balmum is, is mom and bailim, and obviously nothing happens in the Beis Hamikdash. So the R is not disqualified. What's the chiddush here of Rabbi Akiva? So again, the Kedushas Bechor is Chal Mirechem Imo. And the Bechor is a carbon that has to be given to the Kohen, who brings it as a carbon on the Mizbeach. Now, obviously, in such a case, all the general rules of karbonos kick in, and according to Reb Chanina, the R would certainly go to the Kohanim in a case where you discovered a disqualification after you did Hafshata. But on the other hand, if the animal was a balmum, and therefore you can't bring it as a carbon, the Kohen is allowed to shecht it and eat it outside the Beis Hamikdash. Even after it becomes blemished, there's still a number of vestiges of shirayim of its former status as a carbon, and the only use we permit in the state of balmum is to shecht it and eat its meat. Now, if the bechor had been properly shechted and its meat has been rendered permissible for consumption, the Kohen may use the or. However, if the animal died without the benefit of shchita, so that the basa did not become permitted, then even the or cannot be used. It's only the shchita of a bechar balmum that permits the basar and the or to the kohanim. Therefore, where a bechar was slaughtered and found to be a treifa, so that shchita did not permit its meat, we would think that the hide should not become permissible. You don't have a heter of shchita because there's no matter of shchita on a treifa. Rabbi Kiva, however, drew an analogy from Rabbi Chanina's testimony in the case of the blemished bechar, And he came to the conclusion that the shechita of a blemished bechar is analogous to the zrika of a carbon in that it permits the basar of the bechar balmum for consumption. And thus Rabbi Akiva reasons that just as a zrika of a behema tmima bechar is a karma which permits the R to the Kohanim, if its treifa is not discovered until after the Zrika Nafshata, then the Shechita of the Balmum, the Bechar Balmum, will be matir the R to the Kohanim if the treifa status was not discovered until after its Hafshata. Omar Rabbi Chia Bar Abba Rabbi Yochanan Lochik Rabbi Kiva v'Yaf Rabbi Kiva lo Omar Elek Shetiro Mumcha Avaloi Tu Mumcha Lo. When does Rabbi Akiva hold that the or is mutter? That's only when they determine the mum based on a mumcha. Right, you had a mumcha lebechar who would determine that this is a balmum. However, we don't accept Rabbi Chanina, but rather we hold that if the animal is discovered to be a treifa, then it's chal lemafreya, even before the hafshata, and therefore the or has to be burned. And this leads us to the mission of Parma Nisrafim on the bottom of Kuf Dalid Omed Al. Parma Nisrafim, Asira Nisrafim, and we take it outside Yerushalayim to a base Hadeshen, and that's where we burn it. But there's a chumrah in Hilchas Tum V'Tara that the person who actually is misasek with the Parma Nisrafim or the Sira Nisrafim, he becomes Tomei and a Tumah Chamura, and he's Metami the Begadim Sha'ol. Parma Nisrafim, Sira Nisrafim, Bizman Shehem Nisrafim Kimitzvasam, Nisrafim Beis Hadeshen, fine. But Mitamim Begadim, no, it's not only is the person Tomei, but even his garments that he's wearing are Tomei. And this is based on a pasuk in Vayikra Tezayin. The person involved in the burning of the Chatas Yom Kippur is rendered Tomei to the degree that he contaminates his garments or any vessel or clothing that he is touching at that time. Let's say they became pasul, either there was the wrong kavana or whatever pasul the carbon, then the law is that they have to be subject to sreifa. Is nisrafa beis hadbira, then they could be burnt inside the environs of the kedusha, whether it be in the azara or anywhere within the harbais. They don't have the chumrah of tumas begodim. Okay, so that ends Daf Kuf Dalid Amid Aleph. We'll take a break now, and Mitzvah Shem, we hope to get a chance to continue. Thank you.